Great.
So that brings us to business leverage, and it brings us to Dave Nave. So Dave, if you would like to share your screen, the floor is now yours.
I created this little blank page in case it was a longer conversation. But I was going to follow the renaming of this meeting to rebuilding businesses or rebuilding your business. And I wanted to talk about three different things. And this is the process of rebuilding, the design of an organization, and building an organization. Now, this all grew out of the presentation I did 2 weeks ago to this venue here, and it's expanded and more into a story. But this is the process that I usually use, which is new perspectives creates new insights. And I do advisory type consulting, so I don't have a product to sell, but except for the process by which change happens. And the process that I like to use is you define the issue, you create a broader outlook, you explore options, you find the best solution, and then you focus the application. There are two things I wanted to talk about this particular slide, and that's the one on the very left, the picture. This is my representation of what's called best practices. Deming's second theorem states that we are being ruined by best practices. And as organizations are put together and built, many times the owners of the companies will go out and find items, things, concepts that they can bring into the organization, and then they hope that it'll all work together. And many times this picture kind of represents what I see in many organizations. It doesn't quite fit. All the perspectives are different. They change. They're just not right. So in this model, the fourth one in is best solutions, and that can only be accomplished by the owner of the company. And since I do advisory services, the best solution is always the one that can be implemented in the fullest. And that's how I define best. So only the owner can determine that. If we have the absolute perfect solution that nobody follows, then it's not the best solution. It's not. So it's what the owner or the head person, the CEO, the leader of the organization thinks that can fit into the culture of the organization. But in the next about 5 slides, I want to talk about the first two issues. The first two, define the issue and creating a broader outlook. So we're going to use the example of building a house. So if you're going to build a house, you need to have a design. In business, let's call this aligning the principles and the structure. I showed this last time, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But at the top, you have reason, strategy. The two pillars, of course, are process-focused and people-focused. And down the center, holding all this together, is management systems and leadership behavior. The culture aspect of it can be argued that's an outcome of all these other things, or that the culture actually helps build these things. I don't know which is correct. Doesn't really matter. But in designing this, like you design a house, like an architect designs a house, what you end up with is a series of, okay, so many 2x4s, you're going to have this type of roofing, you're going to have this, and all the specifications are identified. And what I advocate is that an organization go out and actually define those. What does that mean to your organization? Not to any organization, specifically to you. How do you view the world? I put some things in here under company define that are just idea starters. They're just things I threw in there that might get you thinking along those roads. It's not necessarily correct. So now that we have a house, we have an architectural design. The items on the side are called bill of materials, or it's a list of the materials and items that go into the house. The next step is to actually build a house. Now, as you're building the house, you have a lot of the plumbers have to talk to the foundation guys, who have to talk to electricians, who have to talk to the HVAC people and the windows people, and all these different trades have to talk to each other and have to communicate and understand that this is an integrated house. Now, in an organization, you have to balance change. So we're going to rebuild the organization. These are 5 elements that I've identified as being essential to any organization. You need to have the strategy, culture, processes, values, and structure. If you change any one of them, it will affect the others. And I've seen a recent example is a local city wanted to change the culture of their the utility workers, the utility department. And they hired someone to come in and specifically address the culture of the department. And what she ended up doing was, of course, talking about the strategy and the processes and the values that the community have and that the organization has, as well as she hadn't quite got to the structure part of it, but it was going in that direction. She was going to have to get there. But I have found that these are all interactive with each other. They all affect each other, sometimes predictably, sometimes not predictably. But it's important to be aware of them, to test them, to check what's going on. So I made this pentagon with all the lines connecting with each other. And of course, I had to put some color into it. So I made a color. At the very center is the fact that the organization has to fulfill some useful purpose. All right. And again, it's not good enough just to have the structure in place. You actually have to go out and define what it is that what does this strategy mean to you? And the organization can help define what does it mean? And then you start looking at how they interact with each other. But the important issue there is to be aware that they all affect each other and to plan for that interaction. And that's as far as I was going to go with my little presentation.
Well, I'm so pleased that you came back and talked more about this. And I love the color that you chose, because I love mixed metals and mixed colors, and I think this is wonderful. But the thing that I find the most helpful is this idea that the center of it all is a useful purpose. Dave, would you share some examples of how these structure and culture and strategy and values and processes interact with each other? Could you give us just 1 or 2 examples?
Well, actually, as I was saying at the beginning, the solution that you come up with has to be accepted by the culture. Actually, almost 20 years ago, I wrote a paper on comparing Lean Six Sigma and theory of constraints. And what I found was that I put the structure in as a primary effect and secondary effect. And what I found was the primary effect of one improvement methodology was a secondary effect of another improvement methodology. And I was looking for which is more successful, which is actually better. And what I found was it depends on the culture of the organization. And so the strategy was, of course, they're going to improve. We were talking about processes. What I found was the culture was the most important. And I found one organization, as I began to present this paper at the different conferences, the next person in line was talking about, he was working with, you don't hear about it here up much, but maybe down in Texas, the maquiladoras that happen, which are facilities that set up on the Mexican side of the border, and they have free trade into the United States. And what he found when he was trying to do improvement in these maquiladoras was there was 9 different languages spoken on the shop floor. And what they did was they started putting up instructions in 9 different languages. And the second thing he found was that just because the people can speak the language doesn't mean they can read the language.
Right.
So in this case, the culture or the process that had to be introduced or that was best fitted for that culture was a visual lean practice that was all visual cues, no words. It was all outlining tools, putting spots on the ground with pictures of the trash can and things like that. That worked best when it was all visual.
Well, that is fascinating. Ruth, have you got a question you'd like to ask Dave?
No, I think this is really interesting, and I'm a big fan of the buckets you're using of structure, strategy, culture, processes, and values, because we really have to look at, balancing transaction with transformation. If we get too transactional, that we're just looking at the linear outcomes of it, we can't actually tap into the complexity of the culture. So when you spoke about the 9 languages being spoken, and what's the easiest way, rather than having everything in 9 languages, coming up with a visual set of cues, it also led to other people building relationships because they have a starting point, that they're like, oh yeah, this is what we call it. And maybe they'll build other relationships around that. So I like that you did that you brought it down to the most equitable in accessible form for the most people to get value out of it.
Thank you, Dave. Will you come back and tell us some more?
Sure, be glad to.